In these poor, underdeveloped countries where, according to the rule, enormous wealth rubs shoulders with abject poverty, the army, and the police force form the pillars of the regime, both of which, in accordance with another rule, are advised by foreign experts. The strength of this police force and the power of this army are proportional to the marasmus that affects the rest of the nation. The national bourgeoisie sells itself increasingly openly to the major foreign companies. Foreigners grab concessions through kickbacks, scandals abound, ministers get rich, their wives become floozies. Members of the legislature line their pockets, and everybody down to police officers and customs officials joins hands in this huge caravan of corruption. The opposition becomes more aggressive, and the people are quick to latch on to its propaganda. Hostility towards the bourgeoisie is now manifest. The young bourgeoisie, which seems stricken by premature senility, ignores the advice proffered and proves incapable of understanding that it is in its own interest to veil, even slightly, its exploitation of the people. The very Christian magazine L'Enseignement Africain in Brazzaville addresses the barons of this regime thus, quote, "Men in power, and you their wives, today your wealth has afforded you comfort, education, perhaps a beautiful home, contacts and many missions abroad that have opened up new horizons. But all your wealth has encased you in a shell, which prevents you from seeing the poverty surrounding you. Beware." End quote. This warning from L'Enseignement Africain addressed to Mr. Yolu's lieutenants is, of course, not revolutionary in the least. What L'Enseignement Africain wants to convey to those starving the Congolese people is that God will punish them. If there's no room in your heart for the people under you, there will be no room for you in the house of God. End quote. It is obvious that the national bourgeoisie is little troubled by such denunciations. Focused solely on Europe, it remains firmly resolved to get the most out of the situation. The enormous profits it makes from exploiting the people are shipped abroad. The young national bourgeoisie is very often more wary of the regime it has installed than are the foreign companies. It refuses to invest on home soil and is remarkably ungrateful to the state that protects and feeds it. On the European Stock Exchange, it buys foreign stocks and spends weekends in Paris and Hamburg. The behavior of the national bourgeoisie of certain underdeveloped countries is reminiscent of members of a gang who, after every hold-up, hide their share from their accomplices and wisely prepare for retirement. Such behavior reveals that the national bourgeoisie is more or less realizes it will lose out in the long term. It foresees that such a situation cannot last forever, but intends making the most of it. Such a level of exploitation, however, and such distrust of the state inevitably trigger popular discontent. Under the circumstances, the regime becomes more authoritarian. The army thus becomes the indispensable tool for systematic repression. In lieu of a parliament, the army becomes the arbiter, but sooner or later it realizes its influence and intimidates dominates the government with the constant threat of pronunciamento. As we have seen, the national bourgeoisie of certain underdeveloped countries has learned nothing from history. If it had looked closer at Latin America, it would have no doubt identified the dangers awaiting it. We thus arrive at the conclusion that this micro-bourgeoisie, despite all the fanfare, is doomed to make no headway. In the underdeveloped countries, a bourgeois phase is out of the question. A police dictatorship or a caste of profiteers may very well be the case, but a bourgeois society is doomed to failure. The band of gilded profiteers grabbing banknotes against a background of widespread misery will, sooner or later, be a straw in the hands of the army, which is cleverly manipulated by foreign advisors. The former metropolis, therefore, governs indirectly both through the bourgeoisie it nurtures and the national army, which is trained and supervised by its experts to transfix, immobilize, and terrorize. The few remarks we have made concerning the national bourgeoisie lead us to an inevitable conclusion. In the underdeveloped countries, the bourgeoisie should not find conditions conducive to its existence and fulfillment. In other words, the combined efforts of the masses regimented by a party and of keenly conscious intellectuals armed with the revolutionary principles should bar the way to this useless and harmful bourgeoisie. The theoretical question, which has been posed for the last 50 years, when addressing the history of the underdeveloped countries, i.e., whether the bourgeois phase can effectively be skipped, must be resolved through revolutionary action, and not through reasoning. The bourgeois phase in the underdeveloped countries is only justified if the national bourgeoisie is sufficiently powerful, economically and technically, to build a bourgeois society, to create the conditions for developing a sizable proletariat, to mechanize agriculture, and finally pave the way for genuine national culture. The bourgeoisie, which evolved in Europe, was able to elaborate an ideology while strengthening its own influence. This dynamic, educated, and secular bourgeoisie fully succeeded in its undertaking of capital accumulation and endowed the nation with a minimum of prosperity. In the underdeveloped countries, we have seen that there was no genuine bourgeoisie, but rather an acquisitive, voracious, and ambitious petty caste, dominated by a small-time racketeer mentality, content with the dividends paid out by former colonial power. This short-sighted bourgeoisie lacks vision and inventiveness. It has learned by heart what it has read in the manuals of the West and subtly transforms itself not into a replica of Europe, but rather its caricature. The national bourgeoisie is born stagnant out of the colonial bourgeoisie and is incapable of transforming the post-colonial society into a bourgeois society because it lacks the tenacity, inventiveness, and wherewithal to sufficiently develop into a bourgeois society. As Fanon notes, in many cases the national bourgeoisie is too small and ineffectual to properly build a new quote-unquote national culture. Either knowing that this is the case or seeing it as more expedient for growing their wealth, the national bourgeoisie instead decides to loot the coffers and deny really any concessions to the people. The struggle against the bourgeoisie in the underdeveloped countries is far from being simply theoretical. It is not a question of deciphering the way history has judged and condemned it. The national bourgeoisie in the underdeveloped countries should not be combated because it threatens to curb the overall harmonious development of the nation. It must be resolutely opposed because literally it serves no purpose. Mediocre in its winnings, in its achievements, and its thinking, this bourgeoisie attempts to mask its mediocrity by ostentatious projects for individual prestige, chromium-plated American cars, vacations on the French Riviera, and weekends in neon-lit nightclubs. Assembly plants, however, are on the increase, a tendency that confirms the neocolonialist model in which the national economy is struggling. In no way, therefore, can it be said that the national bourgeoisie slows the country's development, that it is wasting the nation's time or possibly leading it into a dead end. But the truth is that the bourgeois phase in the history of the underdeveloped countries is a useless phase. Once this caste has been eliminated, swallowed up by its own contradictions, it will be clear to everyone that no progress has been made since independence, and that everything has to be started over again from scratch. This restructuring of the economy will not be based on the order set in place by the bourgeoisie during its reign, since this caste has done nothing else but prolong the heritage of the colonial economy, thinking, and institutions. It is much easier to neutralize the bourgeois class since, as we have seen, it is numerically, intellectually, and economically weak. In the colonized territories after independence, the bourgeois caste draws its main strength from agreements signed with the former colonial power. The national bourgeoisie has an even greater chance of taking over from the colonialist oppressor, since it has been given every opportunity to maintain its close links with the ex-colonial power. But deep-rooted contradictions shake the ranks of this bourgeoisie, giving the close observer an impression of instability. There is not yet a homogeneity of caste. Many intellectuals, for instance, condemn this regime based on domination by a select few. In the underdeveloped countries, there are intellectuals, civil servants, and senior officials who sincerely feel the need for a planned economy, for outlawing profiteers, and doing away with any form of mystification. Moreover, such men, to a certain degree, are in favor of maximum participation by the people in the management of public affairs. I think I oversteeped this jasmine tea. It's a little bit astringent. In underdeveloped countries that acquire independence, there's almost always a small number of upstanding intellectuals without set political ideas who instinctively distrust the race for jobs and handouts that is symptomatic of the aftermath of independence. The personal situation of these men, breadwinners for an extended family, or their life story, hardship, and strict moral upbringing, explains their clear their distrust for the smart Alex and profiteers. These men need to be used intelligently in the decisive struggle to steer the nation in a healthy direction. Barring the way to the national bourgeoisie is a sure way of avoiding the pitfalls of independence, the trials and tribulations of national unity, the decline of morals, the assault on the nation by corruption, an economic downturn, and, in the short term, an anti-democratic regime relying on force and intimidation. But it also means choosing the only way to go forward. The profoundly democratic and progressive elements of the young nation are reluctant and shy about making any decision due to the apparent resilience of the bourgeoisie. The colonial cities of the newly independent, underdeveloped countries are teeming with the entire managerial class. For want of any serious analysis of the population as a whole, observers are inclined to believe in the existence of a powerful and perfectly organized bourgeoisie. In fact, we now know that there is no bourgeoisie in the underdeveloped countries. What makes a bourgeoisie is not its attitude, taste, or manners. It's not even its aspirations. The bourgeoisie is above all the direct product of precise economic realities. Economic reality in the colonies, however, is a foreign bourgeois reality. It is the metropolitan bourgeoisie, represented by its local counterparts, which is present in the colonial towns. Before independence, the bourgeoisie in the colonies is a Western bourgeoisie, an authentic branch of the metropolitan bourgeoisie from which it draws its legitimacy, its strength, and its stability. During the period of unrest preceding independence, indigenous intellectuals and business elements with this imported bourgeoisie endeavored to identify themselves with it. Okay, let's try that again. During the period of unrest preceding independence, indigenous intellectuals and business elements within this imported bourgeoisie endeavor to identify themselves with it. Theirs is a wish to identify permanently with the bourgeois representatives of the metropolis. The bourgeoisie, which has unreservedly and enthusiastically adopted the intellectual reflexes characteristic of the metropolis, which has alienated to perfection its own thought and grounded its consciousness in typically foreign notions, has difficulty swallowing the fact that it is lacking in the one thing that makes a bourgeoisie: money. The bourgeoisie of the underdeveloped countries is a bourgeoisie in spirit only. It is neither the economic power, nor the managerial dynamism, nor the scope of ideas to qualify it as a bourgeoisie. Consequently, it is in its early stages and remains a bourgeoisie of civil servants. Whatever confidence and strength it possesses will derive from the position it occupies in this new national administration. Given time and opportunity by the authorities, it will succeed in amassing a small fortune that will reinforce its domination. But it will still prove incapable of creating a genuine bourgeois society with all the economic and industrial consequences this supposes. The national bourgeoisie from the outset is geared toward intermediate activities. Its power base lies in its business sense and petty trading, in its capacity to grab commissions, It is not its money that is working, but its sense of business. It does not invest and cannot achieve that accumulation of capital needed for the formation and expansion of an authentic bourgeoisie. At this rate, it would take centuries for it to set up the rudiments of industrialization. In any case, it would come up against the implacable opposition of the former metropolis, which will have taken every possible precaution in the framework of neo-colonialist agreements. If the authorities want to lift the country out of stagnation and take great strides towards development and progress, they first and foremost must nationalize the tertiary sector. The bourgeoisie, who wants the spirit of lucre and materialism to prevail, as well as its contemptuous attitude toward the masses and the scandalous aspect of profit or theft, we should say, in fact, invests massively in this sector. Once dominated by the colonists, the tertiary sector is raided by the young national bourgeoisie. In a colonial economy, the tertiary sector is by far the most important. For the sake of progress, the decision to nationalize this sector must be made in the first few hours, but it is evident that such a nationalization must not take on the aspect of rigid state control. This does not mean putting politically uneducated citizens in managerial positions. Every time this procedure has been adopted, it was found that the authorities had in fact contributed to the triumph of a dictatorship of civil servants, trained by the former metropolis, who quickly proved incapable of thinking in terms of the nation as a whole. These civil servants swiftly began to sabotage the national economy and dismantle the national institutions, while corruption, fraud, misappropriation of goods, and black market trafficking set in. To nationalize the tertiary sector means organizing democratically the cooperatives for buying and selling. It means decentralizing these cooperatives by involving the masses in the management of public affairs. All this obviously cannot succeed unless the people are politically educated. Previously, the need to clarify such a paramount issue once and for all would have been recognized. Today, the principle of educating the masses politically is generally taken for granted in the underdeveloped countries. But it is apparent that this basic task is not being honestly addressed. The decision to politicize the people implies that the regime expects to make popular support a condition for any action undertaken. A government which declares its intent to politicize the people expresses its desire to govern with the people and for the people. It should not use a language designed to camouflage a bourgeois leadership. The bourgeois governments of the capitalist countries have long since left this infantile phase of power behind. They govern dispassionately, using their laws, their economic power, and their police force. Now that their authority is solidly established, they are not obliged to waste time with demagogic considerations. They govern in their own interest and make no nonsense about it. They have made themselves legitimate and are strong in their own right. The bourgeois caste of the newly independent countries has not yet attained either the cynicism or the serenity in which the old bourgeoisies based their power. Hence, its concern to hide its deep-rooted convictions to allay suspicions in order to demonstrate its popularity. It is not by mobilizing dozens or hundreds of thousands of men and women 3 or 4 times a year that you politically educate the masses. These meetings, these spectacular rallies, are similar to the old pre-independence tactics whereby you displayed your strength to prove to yourself and to others that you had the people on your side. The political education of the masses is meant to make adults out of them, not to make them infantile. This brings us to consider the role of the political party in an underdeveloped country. We have seen in the preceding pages that very often simplistic minds, belonging moreover to the emerging bourgeoisie, repeatedly argue the need for an underdeveloped country to have a strong authority, even a dictatorship, to head its affairs. With this in mind, the party is put in charge of monitoring the masses. The party doubles the administration and the police force and controls the masses, not with the aim of ensuring their actual participation in the affairs of the nation, but to remind them constantly that the authorities expect them to be obedient and disciplined. This dictatorship, which believes itself carried by history, which considers itself indispensable in the aftermath of independence, in fact symbolizes the decision of the bourgeois caste to lead the underdeveloped country, at first with the support of the people, but very soon against them. The gradual transformation of the party into an intelligence agency is indicated to the authorities. The gradual transformation of the party into an intelligence agency is indicative that the authorities are increasingly on the defensive. The shapeless mass of the people is seen as a blind force that must be constantly held on a leash, either by mystification or fear instilled by police presence. The party becomes a barometer, an intelligence service. The militant becomes an informer. He is put in charge of punitive missions against the villages. Embryonic opposition parties are eliminated at the stroke of a baton or in a hail of stones. Opposition candidates see their houses go up in flames. The police are increasingly provocative. Under these circumstances, there is, of course, but a single party, and the government candidate receives 99% of the votes. We have to acknowledge that a certain number of governments in Africa operate along these lines. All the opposition parties who were generally progressive and strove for a greater participation in the masses in the management of public affairs, who wanted to see the arrogant mercantile bourgeoisie brought to heel, have been bludgeoned and incarcerated into silence and then driven underground. Thank you for watching this reading of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. If you enjoy what you saw, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't done so already. I've got my Twitch and Twitter handles up there. I'll also have links to those in the description. Twitch is where we record most of these videos, and then I edit them together into a more cohesive, less rambly bit. There's also ways you can support me in this channel, and links to my Discord, my music, all that kind of fun stuff. So if you enjoyed it, please consider hitting those up. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.